Now, a few words of introduction about our moderator today. She's our friend, our longtime collaborator of the Writers Institute, Dee Colin. She's also a UAlbany Distinguished Alumna in Arts and Letters and a multidisciplinary artist of Haitian descent whose creative practice focuses on poetry, visual art, and theater. She's the author of the poetry collection, Dreaming in Creole, and she will introduce our guests, so please welcome Dee Colin and Edwidge Danticat.
Hello. I used to teach middle school and high school, so when I say hello, I need response. Hello. Hello. Much better. Thank you to the New York State Writers Institute, Paul, for inviting me here tonight. When I caught wind that Edwidge Danticat would be here, I wasted no time in saying yes to being the moderator tonight. Her work has had a profound impact on me as a creative, particularly as a Haitian-American poet. My first book, Dreaming in Creole, was possible because I read Crick Crack and because I read Breath, Eyes, Memory. I found in the work that I had permission to tell the stories of my family, of my heritage, of my history, and for me, that was profound. Edwidge Danticat is the author of multiple books, some of which I've just named. But in addition to Crick Crack and Breath, Eyes, Memory, The Farming of Bones, The Dew Breaker, Brother, I'm Dying, Create Dangerously, Claire of the Sea Light, The Art of Death, Everything Inside, a Reese's Book Club selection and National Book Critics Circle Awards winner. She is also the editor of The Butterfly's Way, Voices from the Haitian Diaspora in the United States, Best American Essays, 2011, Haiti Noir, and Haiti Noir 2. She has written 7 books for children and young adults, Ana Cayona, Behind the Mountains, 8 Days, The Last Mapu, Mama's Nightingale, Untwine, My Mommy Medicine, and a travel narrative, After the Dance. Her memoir, Brother, I'm Dying, was a 2007 finalist for the National Book Award and a 2008 winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Autobiography. She is a 2009 MacArthur Fellow, a 2018 Ford Foundation Art of Change Fellow, the winner of the 2018, I have to ask for pronunciation, Neustadt International Prize, the 2019 St. Louis Literary Award, the 2011 Bocuse Nonfiction Prize, and 2020 Bocuse Fiction Prize, the 2020 Vilsack Prize for Literature, a 2020 United States Artist Fellow, a 2-time winner of the Story Prize, and 2023 PEN Award for Excellence in the Short Story. Her essay collection, We're Alone, which has brought us all here together tonight, is published, and she teaches at Columbia University. I ask all of you to join me in giving a warm welcome to, I consider, one of the most prolific writers of our time, Edwidge Danticat.
Thank you, Dee, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you to the New York State Writers Institute, to Paul, Mark, and Jennifer for making it possible for me to be here. And thank you to all of you. Before our conversation, I'll just read a brief excerpt from We're Alone, which will explain the title of the book a little bit. So this is the preface. Your hands, give them to me. Let me speak and simply words you cannot forget. We're alone. Wolan Chassagne shore. I spent many years trying to find the original poem, Plage, from which these lines were translated. I came across the English translation in a 1934 book given to me in the 1990s by a friend. The book is The Poets of Haiti, 1782 to 1934, and the translator is an American writer named Edna Worthley Underwood. Underwood was born in Maine in 1873. I don't know how she ended up in Haiti during the latter end of the 1915-1934 U.S. occupation, but she had friends in high places, including Haitian President Sténio Vincent, who wrote her book's introduction. Readers will find in the Poets of Haiti the echo of all great human emotions, Vincent declared. Some of the poems in the collection felt intimate, particularly those by the Jérémie-born poet Roland Chassagne, whose words read like secrets. We're alone is the persistent chorus of the deserted, as in no one is coming to save us. Yet we're alone can also be a promise writers make to their readers, a reminder of the singular intimacy between us. At least we're alone together. Or as A.S. Byatt wrote in her 1990 novel Possession, quote, "The writer wrote alone, and the reader read alone, and they were alone with each other," end quote. Writing for me, particularly writing essays, is a quest for that kind of aloneness/togetherness, as well as something akin to what the Haitian-American anthropologist and artist Gina Atina Ulysse has labeled rassemblage, which she defines as assembly, compilation, enlisting, regrouping of people, spirits, things, ideas. After trying to locate the original Chassagne poem on my own, it finally occurred to me to reach out to Régine Chassagne, a Haitian-Canadian musician and one of the lead singers of the indie rock group Arcade Fire. Roland Chassagne was her grandfather. Régine's father, Stanley, sent her a screenshot of the poem which she shared with me. Plage was published in a 1933 collection by Roland Chassagne called Le Tambourin Voilé, the Veiled Tambourine. I might have translated the verse differently, if perhaps less lyrically. Laisse-moi prendre tes mains et te dire des choses simples et inoubliables. Allow me to take you by the hand and tell you some simple and unforgettable things, because we were alone near the shore under this canopy of palms, and we loved each other. The pleasure was intense and indescribable. In April 1963, during the Duvalier dictatorship, Roland Chassagne was arrested at Port-au-Prince Deschamps Printing House, where he worked as a proofreader. He was accused of being in possession of contraband literature. He was taken to François Papadoc Duvalier's prison dungeon for Dimanche and was never heard from again. Writers die, but not their canopy of language, just as Roland Chassagne still sometimes whispers to me, "Dear reader, please allow me to reach for your hand. We're alone." Thank you.
Thank you for the reading, and I'm going to do my best not to be excited fangirl. I thank you for this book of essays. I find that in your essays, you balance between giving us news or historical facts, but then you build a room of intimacy and personal, and you do it in such a poetic way. there's a part of me that wants to ask if you ever read poetry. But the question is, how do you set up the room to invite us in for that last line, dear reader, you take my hand? What is the process for preparing for that invitation?
First of all, thank you for doing this. It's wonderful that you agreed to do it. I always go back to my experience with storytelling, which started with elders telling stories, and elders who are very animated, the cric crack, tim tim boishesh, like all the call and response of storytelling. And I loved participating, I loved being an audience to it, but I would sit there and as a small girl and think, I'll never be able to do that, like the sort of the performance part of it. But I remember when I was first given a book, and my uncle gave me, like in French, that Madeleine story in a house in Paris that was covered with vines. And then I remember taking the book and just going in a corner and feeling like, okay, however that's done, I want to do that, because it was immediately like this intimacy of like between a reader and a writer, and that feeling of sometimes when you're reading a book, there are people in the book that you know better than people in your own life. That feeling of being so close to a book, and then the fact that there's a repetition to it, that you can read it whenever you want. And to this day, when I read something vulnerable that somebody writes, I feel like I'm always thinking, they trust me. Like, they don't know me, but they trust me. So I think one way to open that door is vulnerability, certainly, which manifests in different ways based on the type of work, but to be, I think I've always heard since I started writing is easy, just open a vein, So I think to be able to like have that willingness to be open, to be raw, to be vulnerable is also then people come, with that sense of intimacy.
Thank you. I write a lot of vulnerable pieces, and it can, there's ways that I have to think about caring for myself in the process of writing. So I'm also curious about what you do as a writer, particularly with the heaviness of the work. And you have a way of making something that is tragic or heavy quite beautiful at the same time. But what do you do for yourself in that process?
Well, I think of the writing itself as the way I deal with loss, with trauma, with pain. I write through it, and I don't see it as something to protect myself from. I just I see it as a way to understand things better. Sometimes a way to process trauma, a way through. I really see it as a way through, and I always feel a little lighter, like a little better. For example, with my memoir, Brother, I'm Dying. I was writing that book with a newborn. My father and my uncle who raised me in Haiti had just passed on, and I would sit, when as much time as one has when a newborn is sleeping, to try to write that story, because it felt like I was visiting with my uncle and my father. So there's a way that, for me, the writing is healing. So I don't, I see it as the self-care, and maybe that's not healthy, but it's really helped me in terms of processing loss.
So that's important to know, that the writing itself is part of the process of caring for yourself. There are questions that you pose in the book when you're talking with you capture the questions that come up when you're talking to young people in Haiti about writing, and the idea comes up that writing can change the world. So as I read different questions throughout the book, I wanted to ask you those same questions. Can writing actually change the world? Is it changing the world? Is that the intention behind, but when you sit down and you're thinking about the impact that the writing can have, and how do we continue that kind of push in our work?
So this program that you're talking about, so in 2018, a friend who was opening a library in a place in Haiti called Fondé Blanc, and they had a festival, like an arts festival with dance and literature, and one of the workshops I did with another writer who was then based in Haiti, Kit Lee Morrison, with young people, and they asked questions like, can writing change the world? And I think at that time, and we were on in Haiti, even in Haiti at that moment, it was July 2018, so it was just really right after the prices went up and the demonstrations, like the Pays Lock, which was a thing, like the lockdown in the country started. So even those young people were on the verge of something massive in the history of their country. So, and that summer before all that began, I was like, yes, it can change the world. But I go back and forth. I think on that, I definitely know it can change my life. Like it's changed my life. Just like again, back to, in the way that goes back to the last question. But I think, the word is powerful itself, and how we use words. We're learning this very well in this current environment. And narrative matters, certainly, especially when we're placed in the situation and having to counter so many, negative narratives, stigmatizing narratives. So, and these young people too, it was in the middle of the countryside in Haiti, we're just still so believing in the word that if you were a journalist, like if you're a writer, if you're that you could change at least your community. So yes, I think we can build community around language. We can build community around the word. Like Toni Morrison had this saying, like we die that may be the I'm forgetting the word, but we do language that is the measure of our lives. Like language, the power of language is has its equivalent in our entire, the way we live.
One of my favorite quotes is, we used to learn an artist's history at the times. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned our current time, but you had a recent article in the Washington Post about recent I don't want to repeat it here. Yeah. We all know what's been said and about Haitians living in Springfield, Ohio. What is the balance? And as a Haitian writer myself, I think about having to prove something but not wanting to, having to explain myself but also not wanting to. How do you find the balance in responding, and how do we discern what distraction is?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of the things that I tried to raise in this op-ed, which was responding, and it was in the Washington Post, responding to the accusations against the Haitian community in Springfield, Ohio. And it's been, the last 2 days, like living through it with our Puerto Rican friends, right? And to see, I always think in those moments of the child that I was at 12 years old, who, we were in school. Back then, Haitians, we were the only people who were put by nationality on the CDC's list of people of high risk for AIDS. So that meant a lot of beatings in school, a lot of being called names, and to see like children going through that again, right? And so, I mean, it's, in the piece, I tried to, again, we'll go back to Ms. Morrison, she has, and I evoked that in the piece where she says, you know, the function of racism, the serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. Like that's her, that's how she phrased it in this talk. I think she did it in the 70s. And where she said, if they say you have no language, then you spend all this time proving you have a language. If they say you have no culture, then you spend all this time proving you have no culture. So I think it's always been our burden, if you will, in a way, like as artists from certain communities, to be like, this is my work, I'm speaking to my community without, as she would put it, the white gaze or a certain gaze. At the same time, every once in a while you have to, you just have to kind of counter, like to speak to whatever this assault of this counter narrative against you. Certainly can't, you don't have the luxury of like always ignoring it, but it's also like that balancing of like, I'm not going to be, my work is not always going to be about responding to your nonsense.
Okay, we're good on time. It's a question I really want to ask. Okay. Let's talk about Morrison, since we mentioned Morrison multiple times. There is an essay in the book where a lot of several literary giants are mentioned, among them Morrison, but also Baldwin and Marshall, and it's just, and you give us these snapshots into your relationship to their work, but also personal relationship in some cases. I want to know how they appear in your work, and I'm curious as to, there's a question that you asked later of what do you read, what do you keep reading? So I'm curious to know, what do you keep reading from them? And we'll start there.
Mm-hmm. So that essay in the book is called "They're Waiting in the Hills," and it's Lauren Hansberry, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Paul Marshall, Audre Lorde, and so these. When I was in high school in 11th grade, my history teacher, Mr. Casey, gave me Mary Evans' anthology of Black women writers, and it had Morrison, had Nikki Giovanni, had everybody with a snippet about their work and then an excerpt from the work. So I started reading them that way. And Paul Marshall, when I read her essay, "The Poets in the Kitchen," I just was blown away because where she talked about poetry, like hearing poetry from her aunts as they were cooking in the kitchen, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's like my family. And Toni Morrison talked about, like, in the essay, in Rootedness, it was an interview that was turned into an essay about writing in the presence of an ancestor. And in that essay, I remember there's a line, "There's always an elder there," right? There's always someone behind, and that's exactly how I felt about writing, because sometimes when I was writing, I would think, how do I know this? Like, I wasn't sure if I'd heard it when I was younger, but then this idea, like, made it concrete for me, like there's always an elder there. So, and then the phrase "they're waiting in the hills" is in Tar Baby, where, Jardini's told these people are waiting in the hills for you, these people who were Maroons who escaped to the hills to not be on the plantations, to not be enslaved. And it's seen also, in Haiti we have this notion, when you die, you return to Guinea, which is like the land of the ancestors, which is like, and so I was asked to speak at her memorial, and that's what I said to her. I said, they're waiting in the hills, and I see literature as a kind of this conversation that we have with ancestors, both the ones in our lives. Paul Marshall called herself an unabashed ancestor worshiper, is what she called herself. So I am that too, and it was just a way to honor just the power and the intimacy that and the imprint that reading them, and also the Haitian writers who I talk about in Create Dangerously, like the impact that they've had and have left on my life.
I think about the proximity to death when it comes up in family. And I just had a great uncle who turned 100 years old. And just the breadth of stories. I think of like family history, and what's your process for choosing what stories you end up writing, especially when it comes to sharing stories about your family?
I mean, it's interesting how some stories will pop up in the process of the writing. For example, my mother, after she passed away, when I was going through her things, I found, and I talk about this in the last chapter, I found a little Jehovah's Witness. She was a Jehovah's Witness when she was younger, but had this Jehovah's Witness brochure that she had with a bunch of pictures of her friends, and those pictures, at that time, you could only really have pictures from photo studios, and people would write notes in the back of the photos to their friends, and often it was like a little bit formulaic, receive this photo as a token of my love, reçois cette photo, and then she had a whole bunch in this little book, and then and I was reading through it. It was, of course, Bible stories, love stories, and then she had one annotation in the whole story, and it was the story of like Rachel and Jacob, and she wrote social class like on the margin of that. And so it's just that the ways, that even though I came to that material when my mother had passed on, it was like she came back alive to me. And I think that proximity to death, having grown up in a family where you were always told, whether it was in the Protestant side of my family, whether it was the voodoo practicing part of my family, that's the one thing they agreed on, that this is not all there is to us, and that we're in a continuum, and that there's more to life than this shell. And so that proximity never felt fearful for that reason, is that there was like a continuity to it that I always felt powerful, that I think is what literature in a way does, like keep people alive. Like again, going back to that feeling when I was writing Brother, I'm Dying of, each time I sat down to write, I felt like I was visiting with my uncle, and I was living with the stories they had told me, and some of them I didn't remember until I started writing. And then if I had a thread, I would then go to someone in the family and say, do you remember that time? And they would fill in some moments for me, which is why it's such a blessing to have an elder who's 100 in a family. That's like 10 libraries.
Yeah, because that's as far back as the U.S. occupation. Through Divided, through Earthquake.
Yeah.
So there's so much there.
Mm-hmm.
So we celebrated him big time.
That's beautiful, yes.
I am grateful for the window into your family history. I think that it not only connects Haitian stories, I think it goes across into other Caribbean stories. I can be empathetic, I can feel offended for what was said about Puerto Rico. And then for me, growing up here,
being born here, growing up here, I've had to learn to find connections, not only with Haitians in Haiti, but also connections to just being Black in America. I wonder about how you navigate different spaces and what stories connect to you, or what stories are you reaching out to?
I mean, I sometimes feel like the stories are reaching out to me, and that it's just often it's stories that like haunt me. It's stories that I just can't forget, and sometimes you remember it's the feeling of that story. I mean, one of the They're Waiting in the Hills chapters, there's I go to Grenada and try to follow this essay, like go through the steps of Grenada Revisited by Audre Lorde, and somehow, because when I did it was that summer of Hurricane Maria, and so Puerto Rico ended up being in the essay. And because the mayor of San Juan, who I saw in a program today, was basically saying, you know, we're being mistreated here, and was talking about colonization, was talking about, you know, like just their rights, and language that was very similar to what Audre Lorde had written in the essay about the invasion of Grenada. So sometimes, sort of like the circularity of these events, and then the stories just trail you. I think the stories are always around us, especially in the sort of the nonfiction, even in fiction. But in nonfiction, there's just so many stories. It's sort of like which stories choose you and which stories you choose, and it often depends on this time in your life. So, for example, for a long time, you know, when my children were small, I didn't really write about them. This is the first time in this book that I'm writing about them with their permission. But part of that was inspired by this experience of being in the same house where my mother is dying and having young children and having them sort of like run around the hospital bed that you get in home hospice, and literally seeing myself in between these generations, and this is something I wanted to document with sort of like the progression of my life through their lives, and so there's also a way that the stories pull you forward, just the way that children pull you forward into the future, and that I also wanted to document at this point in my life, and I'm glad they agreed to be in my essays.
I am curious, the way that people show up in your stories. There's, I think your uncle said something about that you don't write about him.
Yeah.
And he said that he's lucky because you don't write happy things. Or I think that's what the quote is.
Yeah.
If you were to write something happy, what would it be, and why?
I mean, it's funny because I think anybody who is a writer or has a writer in your life, you know this. You're either being told as the writer in the family, like in the people's most intimate moments, they will stop themselves to say, "Don't write about this," or then there are people who will like walk up to you and says, "Man, I have the story. You're going to make tons of money with my story." So you're kind of in between of these people who want to tell you to tell their stories, and that was the same in my family. My mom was always like, "Don't write about me." I wrote about her anyway. I did, like I told the young writers, sometimes writing you keep your promises to the dead, or you break your promises to the dead. And my uncle was always like, "Why don't you write about me?" I was like, "You're very lucky that I'm not writing about you yet." And so that whole thing of like being in the middle of stories and being the person who documents those stories, but it's also trying to, with my uncle certainly, especially his passing on, I realized made me one of now the oldest people in my family. From being, remember him as a little girl to being, to now being among the older people, you see sort of yourself part of in the treadmill of life. And I felt like the essay was a really wonderful place to explore that.
I want to make sure that we have time for questions. I have more, but I want to give people space to ask questions.
I have a microphone. I'll break it. Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you. So I wanted to ask you a follow-up question in regards to writing about your family. One of the things that I struggle with is the respect issue. So I'm always scared that by disclosing information that I'm somehow disrespecting the family and the story of the family. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's a very, I think that's something everybody who writes memoir has to balance. That whole, respecter grand monde, but respect your elders, but also I remember specifically when I was respecter figi maman, respect your mother's face, it's a very specific kind of respect. So what I did with Brother I'm Dying, for example, I asked my brothers to read it first. Because I think sometimes if you're writing a certain way and the people who hurt you, of course you're not going to allow them to read it. Or of course you may not engage in that conversation, but I've negotiated things with my family members, so I'll say, I'll change your name, or if they really don't want to be so, because I want to keep those relationships, unless if it's somebody who's hurt you terribly already, all bets are off. But if it's someone that you want to maintain a relationship with, and sometimes simple things might upset them. So I let them read. For the memoir, I let my brothers read it first. And but I have 3 brothers, and then the funniest thing they said after they read it was why is it all about you? And because I wrote it.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Haitian-American, and when I was wondering, this question is for both of you guys. How do you guys stay in touch with the Haitian culture better? Because, I was born in America, so I kind of always feel distant from my Haitian heritage, which is why I also like to read books by other Haitian artists or Haitian poetry, which brought me into speaking today. So my question is kind of both of you guys, what I hear, not so tips, but how do you guys stay in touch with Haitian culture?
For me, I was very intentional as a child to retain Creole as a language I speak. It was my first language. I didn't learn English until I started school, despite me being born here. Creole was just the language we spoke at home. We didn't speak English at home. And I knew I was very decisive as a kid that if I ever visited Haiti, I wanted to be able to speak to my family. And that was an open window for me to stay connected. I have a lot of family members who don't speak Creole at all. So there's other ways that they have to try to be connected. For me, that means reading books like Edwidge Danticat. If there's an opportunity again to visit Haiti, I think right now might not be the best time, but throughout my life, I've had the opportunity to go, and that was life-changing for me. I was 13, my first memorable trip to Haiti was when I was 13 years old, and at the time I was in middle school. I had gone through being called names. I had doubts about how dark my skin was, and there's nothing like landing on an island where there's
people who look like you everywhere. And so I came back with a different mindset. I think sometimes the news that's negative is easily accessible, and we have to do a little more work for the images of Haiti, the history of Haiti, the culture, the food, all the things that we are able to celebrate about who we are. We have to do a little more work and be intentional about that. So I would say continue reading, but also find spaces where you feel like you can grow, and also where you can embrace who you already are.
Yeah, and like being here today, being in a community, I was really pleased to see that the Haitian Students Association was a co-sponsor of this, because I was in what we call HSA when I was at Barnard. I was in that, and some of those folks are my friends until today, like decades later. If there's a community organization in the neighborhood you can volunteer with. I did that when I was at Brown, and I got to know new arrivals. Like I volunteered with, to help, just like entertain a child who's just new in the community. If there's a community center that you can volunteer at, I think the community center, you'll get to see the whole range of like people who've been here for a while, people who are new arrivals. And then you also get to contribute to the community. I know young people who've learned Creole through that kind of work, through volunteering. And then whenever you volunteer at a community, there's always going to be some really good Haitian food. So, so that will be a perk of that interaction. And often they have shows, they have arts, everything comes often through our community centers. So that would be a good place if there is one around here to connect with.
There is a Haitian restaurant on Wolf Road if anybody wants to go support. They're good.
Hi, my name is Edwidge. I was born and raised in Haiti. I left in 2021. And I read one of your books, which was Quick Crack, if I remember correctly, and also reread the text in class this week. Honestly, I have double feeling about the text I read in class, because yes, it was a metaphor of describing Haiti, but at the same time, I feel like there's a missing part, especially for me living throughout this whole situation getting worse and worse. But the question I have here is what are some tips that you would give to a young person like me that wants to write and to impact global, or especially in Haiti, because I think one of the issues that we have back there is education, which is not available for every people.
So write the missing part. We all kind of, we all stand on the shoulders of people, and when you read the text, it's not immediately when it's written. Books, like by the time a book is written, it's almost 2 years to the time that it's published. And even if the text was written yesterday, no one person has the full perspective. I mean, I think that's what writers of color often encounter, that one person has to tell everybody's stories. So, and we also have a very rich literature of people currently writing in Haiti. So if you want to read about Haiti from Haitians in Haiti right now, there's a website named Aibo Post. They have, and their reporters are writing in Haiti to the moment. And it's in Creole, it's in French, and it's in English. So I would recommend them. Sometimes one of their writers, Widlor, writes for the Washington Post, but they write for their own online media. So look at them for sort of like people writing directly from Haiti to a global audience. But if you want to write what you I was just sitting, courtesy of someone wonderful, in Toni Morrison's chair upstairs at her desk, and right next to that chair was a quote that is often repeated of hers. If there's a story, I'm paraphrasing, even though I just saw it. If there's a story that you're not seeing out there, write it.
Hello, thank you, Edwidge Danticat. Thank you both for this conversation and also for your work. I'm actually thinking of two novels that you wrote, Red Light's Memory and The Farming of Bones. I love those. And I'm really struck by the way that you've been able to engage history. And it's interesting you bring up Toni Morrison, who wrote Beloved when she was here. And I've been very curious about whether or not you would consider, or if you're working on writing about the Haitian Revolution.
No, I'm not going to write about the Haitian Revolution because it's a bit, there's actually some wonderful books about the period around the Haitian Revolution. Actually, Marlena Dowd has a book coming out. It's like a nonfiction but written, I think, in a sort of an accessible way about Henri Christophe. That also frames, has some of the Haitian Revolution. And there's Evelyne Trouillot's a novel that, and a lot of Haitian literature now gets translated into English, like Evelyne Trouillot's The Rosalie l'Infâme, the infamous Rosalie. It's not quite the revolution yet, but, and then Marie Vieux-Chauvet's La Danse sur le Volcan, Dance on a Volcano, which is around that period. So I think the level of research that it would require, it's sort of not my period, but I would love to see a wonderful novel on the women of the Haitian Revolution, but not for me right now. But and if people are interested, he's not Haitian, but Madison Smart Bell has that trilogy on the Haitian Revolution, like 3 novels on that period. But thank you for your question.
Great. Question up here, and I'm going to head to the other side, so if you have questions, put your hands up and I get over there.
Hi, thank you for being here. I read Farming of Bones in high school, and I'm going to reread it again just because I feel like it intertwined cultural and emotional memory so well. And I feel like one of the undercurrents in that book was grief, and I feel like I could always use more help navigating grief. I wondered if there are any writers that helped you navigate grief, or any stories that you could think of that really helped you contextualize how complicated of a feeling grief is.
Thank you. When, after my mom passed away, I wrote a book called The Art of Death. It's in this series by Grey Wolf Press, and it's a series for those of you who write that I would recommend. They have the art of description, the art of syntax, like every possible aspect of writing is covered in that series. And I started writing that to kind of figure out how others have written about death, because I needed to, after living, through and with such a tremendous loss that was very complicated by years of separation through through immigration and so forth. So in that book, there's a very long list of people that I have read over the years who have helped me, and among them is like the Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, all the Morrisons, just and especially people who've also written about losing their mothers. Simone de Beauvoir has a book called An Easy Death. There's a big bibliography of that in there. But I want to say something too about the Farming of Bones, because we're in October is the, in 1937, there was this massacre of Haitians and Black Dominicans in the Dominican Republic, and that's what this book, The Farming of Bones, is about. And we're seeing, it's like a resurgence of anti-Haitian and treatment, these massive deportations in the Dominican Republic, which also brings back a lot of the issues that are also raised in that book.
Questions on this side? Any questions in general? Okay.
Hi, I'm Fred Pfeiffer from here in Albany. I remember working with the Haitian Student Association fighting apartheid some decades ago, so I really appreciate presence on campus and the diversity. And more and more I'm encountering a lot of great books written by women of color who are journalists, Nigerian women writing about what's going on there in Africa. And as a white man, I try to place myself in these movements as to what I ought to be doing. I know in the media they talk about young white men not knowing where their place is. Well, that's a challenge for white men, and we need to stand up and embrace the challenge. So my question is, how has Albert Camus affected you? He's one of my favorite philosophers that I don't understand very much. I know he's French and was part of the resistance. And I know you cited him, picked up this book in a Goodwill store in Florida. I was enchanted to create dangerously. So if you could just inform me a little bit on your relationship with Albert Camus, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. Albert Camus, the French-Algerian writer, contemporary of Jean-Paul Sartre and others, even though they had a falling out over the war in Algeria. I mean, like every school child, the first book of his that I read was L'Étranger, The Stranger, because it was assigned in school. And then I came across, just like you did in this used bookstore, I came across an essay of his, because L'artiste et son temps, the artist in its time, but it was translated as Create Dangerously. And it starts out, with him trying to, because he had, this dilemma about being an artist, and he didn't appear to Sartre and others to take strong enough positions on the war in Algeria, even though he was from Algeria, and he would cite the fact that he had to be careful what he said because his mother was there, right? And then that wasn't enough for them, like, ideologically. But when I was reading through his essay, it starts out, and I would recommend it, now they published it as a little book, and there are things that he's talking about, and he died soon after. The essay was a lecture, and he died soon after in a car crash after he gave that lecture. But he starts out with saying, writers, artists are damned if you speak, basically damned if you don't. And the fact that, people read into your silence a certain thing, and then they sort of counter your words in a certain way. And he really beautifully, and he wrote novels, of course, and he was a big bestseller during the pandemic because everyone was reading The Plague, which is a beautiful, like really a wonderful, powerful novel. But his essays are also gorgeous. The philosophy, I'm with you, is a little hard. So it's not as hard to pierce through as Nietzsche and these other philosophers, but it's still like it requires time. But he writes beautiful essays because he was also a columnist for a newspaper. And so I recommend his essays, especially this one and there are many, on the artist's role and time. And he talks about, there's a beautiful thing he writes in that essay about what was the writer doing in the stands of the Colosseum as the lion was crushing the victim. So he really places he really tries to parse through without being overly prescriptive, without telling people what to do, what it's like to be an artist wrestling with serious issues during very difficult times. So I recommend him to everybody, especially that essay, which is called Create Dangerously.
Good afternoon, Edwidge. Welcome back to the university.
Thank you.
Looking at Yellow, I was struck by the artwork on the cover. I think it's telling a story in and of itself. So if you can talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so I'm glad you asked. So the book cover. So every once in a while, I write about photographers, artists. It just sort of depends on what else is happening in my life. I have time, but I was asked to write about this young Haitian-American photographer named Edwidge Danticat, and it was during the pandemic, and she was taking pictures in parks of family members, and this was one of the photographs that showed up on her website when this wasn't from the pandemic series, but it's called Cérémonie Disparition, like disappearing, a ceremony on disappearance. And I remember looking at the picture and I thought, that will have to be the cover of this book. Like, it was so perfect. There's a lot of water in the book. There's a description in the book of the essay as a body of water. The Chassagne poem is called Shore in English, and there's a beach. It's called Plage in French, and I thought this has to be the cover. And what you're seeing, so it's a woman, and her photography, she poses, she creates these situations, and there's so many things that are familiar to us, like, there's the palm tree reflected on there, and then there's the tin, which is like we call tol, which is used to make like homes, and then just the photo within the photo. We all have these photos of being little girls with the bows in our hair. It's that everybody has one of these photos, like if you're a Haitian girl of a certain age. So it just had so many things that, as you say, that tells a story on its own. And I'm glad she allowed us to use the photograph on the cover of the book, because I think, as you said, it begins to tell the story it begins to start describing the essays even before you open the book.